Hello everybody and welcome to 666. Scary. Age 666. We should have been talking about Nietzsche, I get a feeling of. But that won't happen today, I'm afraid. But I think it is still a good idea to take up Nietzsche. Probably do that in the week that comes. We met up with a friend who spoke warmly about a old friend of mine who's an expert in Nietzsche. Could be an actually interesting subject to take up. How about making a podcast with him? Hey, I continue on here. Today's subject is, what would the self be if we look at the evidence? And I'm mainly thinking about what we learned from Benjamin Libet, Hayes, and all the other ones that follow in that series. The revolution that we understood that consciousness does not have anything to do with our actions. It's too late. At least 0.2 seconds. And by then, the action is already initiated. And in some cases, if it's a quick action, it's already finished. So there is a time delay. And last lecture, 565 and 64. We spoke about that. It's quite interesting, but consciousness does not have the role that is commonly thought it has. Not at all. And I would go even further in this lecture to point at what we mean by consciousness, or the subject is not coherent, is not pointing to something specific. It's a little bit like saying, look, there is a thing, and you are trying to mean that what you are perceiving to be an object or something is part of a tree, some air, some water, and the tail of a horse. And not only that, it also varies. Now this is of course impossible because of the private language argument. Even if you wanted, you cannot make up your own definitions, or can you make up your own words? This is the same actually, but consciousness still have a part in the language game, but it, I propose, has never done what we think it does. It has a role in the language game, but it doesn't refer to anything specific. It's more something we say in a certain context. Well, this is hopefully going to get clearer once the lecture progresses. But one clearly important question is, I started here, what is consciousness? Where is the self? But equally important is, where is it? Where is it localized? And I mentioned that marvelous article by Richard E. Lind that he's showing how consciousness left its proper place in the body and went somewhere else. That's the progression of transcendence. And usually we meant the head after that consciousness is in the head. But it was not in the same way, no longer in a body head, but literally somewhere else. So we went from something that was defined, that was consciousness, to something that was unclear and persistently unclear. But what also happened was that the localization was no longer clear. Richard E. Lind often mentioned the head as the place, but he also says it's a transcendence, it's not actually the head. Even if you often point to the head, what we say, you are thinking. This is connected to the Western dogma, the unspoken hypothesis that places the self in front of space where object is situated. That could also be termed object in space under the observance of the subject. And in this picture, this image, it's only the subject who has an awareness of the object, and both the subject and the space is fixed. And this is somewhat similar to Euclidean space. That's built on the idea that there is a reference point to be taken. And the reference point in Euclidean space is supposed to be flat surface, flatness. On this flatness, all lengths could be put and compared. And where this flatness exists, nobody says. But we need to remember that geometry began in Egypt on land that was fairly flat, and somewhere in the process land itself got abstracted, elevated to almost not existing. And that tendency progressed with the Greek, and in the end disappeared. Well, it hasn't really disappeared, it's still there. And this can also be compared to a coordinate system. The coordinate system's space is static in order so that the changeable object can be presented. It's impossible otherwise. And it's looked upon by the origo, that's the reference point. That's the inertial frame of reference. You can think of X, Y, Z, vertical, horizontal, and perpendicular. These will together make the coordinate system to define where the object is placed. And then you can also have a movement going from one definition X, Y, Z to a second definition X, Y, Z. Therefore, we define movement in reference both to the static empty space and also to origo, the origin. And that's a specific new type of movement that hasn't existed before Newton. Well, at least not before Descartes, but I'd say Newton actually. And if you move over to physics, then you have an inertial point of reference or inertial point of framework, or you might call it absolute space or absolute time. There was much discussion between Leibniz and Newton about this, and they were often using a bucket, and said that the forces in the bucket going to the sides of the bucket could be a reference point. That's only possible if you have a reference point towards the gravity in the bucket could be directed. And this proved to Newton there was such a thing as an inertial point of reference, whereas Leibniz hinted to what became the sensible solution today, that the reference point for the bucket is the whole of the universe, and that's no longer a reference point, it's the whole, and that's a bit different. And of course, as I mentioned before, in the articles of Richard E. Lind, the marvelous Richard E. Lind, it's the reflective consciousness that moved up to the head, away from the world and all that sordid business in the world, irregularities and all that thing. And I need to make a very important point there. Those irregularity, messy stuff, and the sordid nature of nature that today think would be the case if we don't have Newtonian physics or the coordinate system or whatever. That's definitely caused by being in the reference system. It's nothing messy with the real world. It's not sorted. Actually, the only place of correctness is the real world. There cannot be any correctness in the coordinate system. There's no chance of that. You can also think of it this way: if the present movement is the only movement that's possible, or there's something fundamental to that, what on earth was movement before Cartesian coordinates? What on earth was movement before Newton? And I think we need to remember this proof, because if we don't remember that, we are going to lose our lighthouse completely. We cannot use our intuitions, and please don't do that. The movement you see in front of you now is not a proper movement. You are no exclusion. You are part of the Newtonian movement idea. And the movement you see is the Newtonian, not the proper movement. You can also think of the poor Hindus by the big ghats of the subcontinent. Do they not have movement? Of course they have. Don't need Newton to have movement. The Hollow movement, I'd say, that's my guess, is the real movement. That's the only movement that exists, I'd say. It's the Hollow movement. It's true, more fundamental. It's not dependent on those things we know don't exist, inertial point of reference, an origo, or a transcendent I. None of those things are needed for the Hollow movement. But also laws of movement as perceived by quantum mechanics or by Julian Barber. And they deny, both of these directions deny any of the Newtonian movement. And hence they deny Newtonian space and time. But I would gamble to say time and space existed before Newton. It's there still, but it's not a system. It's not something transcendental. I'd even go so far to say time and space are completely real, not constructs. So, what's happening if you have this object in space seen by a subject? Well, in daily talk and in general speak, in common sense, we think for some reason it is the mind that produces the thoughts. And here all the problem starts, because then mind de facto becomes something that is ex posteriori. Because what we first have are the thoughts, and if we make the misconception that our looking at the thoughts, analyzing them, recognizing them, not recognizing them, that is the producer of the thoughts as well, that's a grave mistake. It's the same as saying if you work in a factory and you check out the goods, the machines that they produce, for instance cars, are correct, important work to be done. If you would for some reason think you also do the cars, make the cars, then you are gravely mistaken. And this is exactly the same mistake. We do something ex posteriori and we put those properties to something that happens before. And that means that we never ever are able to catch consciousness, because we always delayed. It's the same delay, 0.2 seconds, that is consciousness. There is also distance. That distance is that you perceive your consciousness to be in the head. Do you do that? Then you have a reflector's consciousness working and you self-identify with it. Nothing to be worried about, nothing's going to happen. Probably always been like that. Starting talking about cars, we can compare it to cars. We can say that to say that the mind, talk about the mind, consciousness, subjectivity in the Western world is erroneous as saying that you have an object consisting of two front wheels, like a car, a little piece of the gravel in front of it, and the gloves you forgot to the passenger seat. That's a car. That sort of car won't ever work as thing, language game. And this is the same consciousness. You can never go from the concept of Western concept of mind or consciousness and subjectivity to the proper subjectivity of consciousness. That's impossible. You can't go that way. You can't deduce proper consciousness for our world of consciousness. And I think that goes to show that all that literature that are trying to use consciousness in one way or the other are thereby having a great problem. And even worse so when we translate foreign literature in places where they do not have object in space in front of subject with the word consciousness, mind, subjectivity, self, you name it. That will always be wrong in a way that cannot be fixed. You cannot add words to tell I'm in consciousness but take away that feature or something. No, because the original one is default. It points to things around it and doesn't define what things around should be part of it. It doesn't have any meaning to it. say consciousness is as close as a completely meaningless word that can be. But it can be used trivially. I wasn't conscious of it. Might as well say I forgot it. I didn't see it. But don't make consciousness anything special. It doesn't have any explanatory power whatsoever. None. And the more you use it, the more you think about it, the more confused you are bound to get. The simple reason is this is proven. This is what Libet proved. Consciousness is an ex posteriori construction. We know that. Never knew it before. Now we know it. Just as we have a before and after, there is a before and after when it comes to consciousness. What we term consciousness is something after. And actually, that could be anything. It doesn't necessarily have to do anything with pure consciousness. Some cases it could, some cases could not. But you will never ever be able to tell which does and which doesn't. There is also another thing, and that is that consciousness used in this manner is completely new. It doesn't have a history within it. So what to do? Well, the solution could be something I don't like myself, and that is to use Sanskrit words. Proper words for the things that has to do with things that are not so tangible. And as you all know, in the Vedic tradition and in Samkhya, in Advaita, thoughts are not immaterial. They are material. And that's why you can observe them. And I think that is indirectly proven by Libet, that thoughts are material. You can only observe things of materiality. It's nonsensical to say that you can observe things that are material. And I do venture to say that is an equally important aspect of the situation. We have not in Western tradition realized that thoughts are material. That's quite important. And that's reason for that is, once again, sorry to be repetitious, but you need to remember this. And that is that object in space in front of subject is a dogmatic focal setting that need to be more flexible. As long as it's stranded in this situation, we get off result. Focal setting need to be fluent. Otherwise, you don't have good solutions. Reality doesn't take just one focal setting. And having just one focal setting is the static subject, more or less. And it's a dogmatic thing, and there is no reason for it. Never been supported by any argument even, or no thinking either. And thinking is needed here. We need to think hard and deep on these things. What is actually mind? And to do that, we need to use new terms, I'm afraid. It won't work otherwise. For instance, we get this very difficult problem: whether something is getting observed, who's observing it? Well, in the case of quantum physics, you could say that thoughts are making the superposition to collapse. But that could also be seen that there's a material effect. Thoughts are material, they have a material effect, and therefore the inclusion of thoughts as a representation makes the superposition collapse. There is also tendencies. If we are thinking in this ex posteriori way and we try to keep it up, there is a certain tension in the mental field, and there's also tension in the bodily field. And there's a certain sharpness to it. That sort of thinking has the quality of being sharp, hard. It has definite ends, because something observing something else in the ex posteriori is a bit unnatural, the proper way of doing things, and that gives a certain sharpness to the whole thing, like an end, starting point, and an end point. Beyond the end point there is nothing, and before the starting point there is nothing. And this is an effect. This is an effect by chance from the hardened dogmatic focal setting. And of course this is a very good explanation to the situation in the world here. We don't control our thoughts, no one can control their thoughts. And all of a sudden it's so much easier to understand the quantum physical concept that you can create reality. Yeah, your thoughts will create reality, but you are in no control of them. And this mistake of thinking that mind produces thoughts, that's where it starts. Then it's a little bit like quantum physics gives you a magical wand. And with this magical wand you can create gazillions of dollars and whatever you want. You have as little control of your thoughts as you have control of the world. There's no difference whatsoever in that case. But control can still be held. Not in this instance. You can in the instance have no control. What you can do is to change the material, instantiation. In the same way you change something material, you rebuild your kitchen, you put fenders on your car, you add some detail to your shirt if you're good at sewing, and so on. You can materially change yourself. And how do you materially change yourself? Well, it's a change of what you do, your actions. The actions will mold your system into something else. And there is also, exactly there is where the proper consciousness is. Something that we most commonly disregard, never care about. We don't have any word for it, it's not recognized as something, but it is moldable. And it's even been taken to the same situation that Benjamin Libet presented. And it's shown that you can actually gain control of what you do, but not through those by default useless terms, mind, consciousness. And as long as you keep those thoughts and you don't think the whole thing through, you will be doomed to just produce whatever comes along. Well, you will produce whatever comes along. But it's a sort of a discipline where you can gain power, and that's also readable in the Vedic scripture, as well in Samkhya, Advaita, et al., or there's some subjects. How you progress conscious control. This is conscious, it's not consciousness, it's not mind. This is something completely different. So little by little I would try to get in a new vocabulary, and I'm afraid, well, I'm myself afraid, because I don't really want that, but there will be a need to put in Vedic terms in these lectures as a helping tool. There won't be as many as the Heideggerian terms, but there'll still be a few of them. And their meaning needs to be established by time, so we learn to realize there is such a thing as a conscious mind. There's also such a thing as will, but those things look completely different. They have a different definition, and they're not to be confused with the ex posteriori reflective consciousness. Because that is a whole other animal. And now we also come to a greater understanding why Milgram is so devastating on our culture. It's because we don't realize we can change ourselves. We just say things these days. Say you believe in morale, say you believe in religion, God, or whatever. Take it to the Milgram test, it's proven without a doubt you don't believe in any of those stuff, because you don't know how to have control of the flow of thoughts. That's unheard of in Western culture, doesn't really exist here. And that's caused by the object in space in front of subject. As long as that gestalt is well established, that will stop any change whatsoever. It's complete impossible to do any change, because what you are going to try to change is something that you yourself make up ex posteriori, after the fact. It's a little bit like saying I'm going to make a painting. When the painting is finished, you just say to yourself, I want to change the painting, and then you don't have it in your hands or anything, it's gone, it's sold. That's of course impossible. So before and after are one of those things that our culture do not understand at all. Therefore, it's so incredibly important. Nota bene, never ever forget that consciousness in our culture is something ex posteriori. And when you think you are conscious of something, you're not. Proven by Benjamin Libet. And you don't have any control over your thoughts at all. You cannot produce thoughts, you can't do anything with thoughts. They just come up out of the system. Well, I think we mentioned it indirectly in when we took up that sergeant, what's his name, Joe Dispenza. Show that 98% of what we know, our cognitive resources, are unconscious. Why they're not really unconscious, but they are blocked out by the idea, the gestalt of object in space in front of subject. I think this is very hopeful for the future. We will be able to have true philosophy, true religion, true change of mind, true change of personality. We could be conscious, but we need to understand one or two or three of the limited gestalts that are in the bottom of just our culture, not other cultures. And we need to sort of reverse the amnesis of Martin Heidegger. And I think it can be done. This is with an hopeful note that I terminate this lecture and say thank you very much. And until next, I said goodbye.